This is
Hello,
William.
you may.
Can you hear me?
Hi, William. Yeah, I can. Thanks.
There we go. Start sharing my screen.
Others? And you may be on mute. If I don't say yes, hi, I didn't hear you. I see Blaine on our webinar, but I don't hear him.
Thank you. I'm sorry. I'll try a third time. Blaine from Neighborhood.
Hi, Blaine. Thanks.
You bet.
Anyone else who I didn't capture? Is it just the two of you? Okay. That's all I'm hearing, Blaine and William. Were we expecting any others? We're just checking to see if we're expecting many others. Diane was going to try calling in, but she's traveling, and so she was worried about her connection. All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and get us started with our walkthrough and hope that others join us along the way. Just want to bring us to our agenda for the day. We're going to spend some time reviewing the charter that we started, that Krista helped get us started with last time, and we've provided some sort of updates and adjustments based on your feedback to date and some others that we're sort of asking about. So we'll walk through that, and I think that's going to start to get into some of these questions of our temporary decision making and kind of priorities for the coming few months. We're also going to check in on OPCA bylaws because, as you'll recall, we need to seek approval for this as a formal committee of the board, so we'll look at that as well. We'll talk about our committee members for this group and the work group that will be convened to inform the Accuray Cork process on behalf of Oregon. We'll touch a little bit on a scope of work for a consultant, and then spend our last half hour on the Accuray performance framework, and just start brainstorming, you know, take a look at what OCHA and Accuray sort of recommended as a starting point for what that accountability or performance framework might look like, and start getting your ideas and thoughts about how to elaborate upon those. And I neglected to change the last item here. I think you all saw that the OCHA and Accuray team requested that we reschedule that update that we had put on the books. I think they wanted to be sure that the appropriate people could be present for the demo, so we've pushed that back to next month. We're going to take a little bit of the time we had set aside for that, just so that we don't rush through these charter and bylaws discussions, but we will still try to get you out half an hour before expected. Are there any questions about the agenda?
I'm good on my end.
Okay. And I see that Aaron joined us. Are you on, Aaron? I don't know if you have audio yet. Or if you might be on mute. Okay. I'm not hearing you if you are trying to connect, so hopefully you'll join soon, or also feel free to use the chat box if you have comments or questions. So, Krista, do you want to pull up the charter first?
Sure.
And let me call your attention to the charter. This kind of updated draft was sent out to you, I think, last week by Therese. And I just wanted to kind of walk through want to try to further refine and get to some clarity around this committee description, particularly our goals, and call your attention to some of those items that I think really guide the things that we've talked about so far, your decision-making process, and who's on the committee. So let's take a look at that description. And one of the key questions that I think is sort of implied in this description and that relates as well to the bylaws is the nature of your role as a committee of OPCA. And so this current description reads that the Data Warehouse Governance Committee is a group compiled of health center representatives to oversee implementation and evolution of the Data Warehouse Strategic Plan. My recommendation is maybe to adjust that language to say something more like guide the execution of it. I'm trying to make sure that we're sort of not so deep as to be operational by the nature of this committee, and just in keeping really with other committees of this board. So I'm curious about what language seems to make sense with you around that part of the role. And then secondly, this isn't really written within this committee description, but the other related piece is that in the bylaws, kind of framing your responsibility to make recommendations to the board versus decisions relative to the board. And I think that's something that we'll probably discuss in more detail under a consultant's direction when we get into some of those governance issues. But I wanted to kind of, you know, in order to approve the bylaws, I think we do need to have some language related to that, and I wanted to get your thinking about that aspect of your role. So let me open it up to questions and just a conversation about how to frame the role of this committee.
This is William.
Did you? Go ahead, William.
Thanks. I was wanting to kind of understand that relationship with the board a little bit, and you know, the idea of recommendation is fine with me. Where it gets a little cloudy is as we talk about who's participating and who's not participating in the data warehouse, and how that evolves over time, and then how that links to the board decision or approval or process related to how it, and I realize this is we're kind of in the transitional or in the development phase of this, but I think now would be a good time to understand what that looks like relative to the board. And then there's kind of a corollary to that, which is how the Data Warehouse Governance Committee engages with the members or the health centers that are participating in the data governance warehouse over time. I don't know if those are separate because of the structure of the board or not, but I think clarity around those is really important.
I agree, William. Other thoughts?
This is Blaine. I guess I just concur with what William mentioned, and trying to understand that would be good. And I back to the earlier part of what you mentioned, Laura, with the not getting into the weeds or too operational. I'd like you to maybe to restate that dialogue just briefly for me when I'm looking at this language. If you have a proposal, I guess is what I'm wondering out of that dialogue as well.
Yeah, you know, I don't know that I'm wedded to particular language. I just, I guess when I was looking at this just before walking in here, the end of this first sentence, that piece that's highlighted, oversee implementation of the strategic plan, just feels pretty operational to me. almost like looking at work plans and the like, and which I think historically with respect to our other committees, that's a little deeper than we've tended to go. So I'm thinking like guide the strategy of,
like a form or
yeah. I like the evolution. I mean, I think you should be the ones, you know, I think this body should be the ones sort of adjusting the strategic plan as it goes. Just trying to, and maybe it should say, guide the execution and evolution of the data warehouse strategic plan.
mm-hmm.
Or it could just say guide the strategy and evolution.
Okay.
Because execution and implementation mean the
Are
same thing.
similar, yeah. So that piece,
Yeah.
so anyway, let me get your reaction. I think this is going, so I'm seeing two separate issues. One is the relationship of the committee to really OPCA staff and the as I said, like, you know, the work that flows from this plan. So that's what we're talking about right now. And then the second is the relationship to the board, and particularly how decision-making flows. So let's start, because I wonder if it's a little easier with the relationship to staff in implementing the plan. Do folks feel comfortable with Craig's suggestion around guide the strategy and evolution of the data warehouse strategic plan and pull out the implementation piece?
Yeah, this is Blaine. I guess I would say that I wouldn't mind seeing something a little firmer than guide the strategy. I think I like, Craig, your suggestion of strategy. I think it, to your point, Laura, it pulls us out of the operational with that language. But I wouldn't mind something a little stronger, because I personally have a desire, as this develops, thinking in terms of the longer term and the ICA discussion that we've had, of how this may feed into that.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe we keep oversee in there, so they could be oversee
Oversee the strategy and evolution
Oh, okay.
instead of guide.
It feels
Is
fine
that
from my
better?
perspective.
Okay.
Yeah.
Other comments or thoughts on that, Krista? Can you pull up so we can see if Erin is commenting at all?
Oh, nope.
Or would we get an
Yeah.
alert?
Yeah,
Oh,
I am here and I'm late kind of joining, but yeah, following along, and I'm
Okay.
in agreement.
Okay.
Thanks.
Anyone who can't live with that language? Okay, so let's get back to William's point then about the relationship to the board. And so that's not really written in this committee description, but I imagine it should be somewhere in this document. And as I noted, we'll turn to this soon, it is, I think, should be implied in the bylaws when the Data Warehouse Governance Committee is framed, which is, again, that relationship to the board. And so I have a couple of thoughts. Number one, because of where we are currently, or at least in our current situation, we're still, I think, a committee that's representing the whole of OPCA membership with respect to advancing these data warehouse strategies with an eye to the whole membership. And so from that perspective, I feel like making recommendations to the board, you know, to frame it in terms of recommending to the board any decisions, I think is reasonable, but I understand fully William's point that if this were to become more of a participation model where some people opted in and opted out, and presumably some had financial stake in the effort and others didn't, that you would want the decision-making authority to rest with those who were participants. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, for me, I think that is. You know what's interesting as you're talking to Laura, for me, is that the idea of the decision, it really relates both to, I suppose, Ocean and Epic as well as to other vendors and other processes that have kind of been built into this over the next so many months or year. And it seems to me that most decisions within the context of that flow to the board, and it makes sense, and it's a reasonable thing. There is a question is there a time frame or a deadline, or is there some decision that would imply at that point in time that decision isn't just about a recommendation, but potentially it's about X number of health centers are in, Y number of health centers are out, and there's a different process at that point in time. And I'm not trying to set that up. I'm trying to anticipate what would the conflict be around a decision that would require a higher level of engagement by health centers in order to move the process forward, and what's the best way to get a good decision out of that process after we've done so many vendor presentations, after we've developed some basic pieces. It seems to me we're moving towards a decision at some point in time, and kind of understanding that today might be a good thing to do.
Craig, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts or reflections, insights on how other PCAs have kind of handled that, or, I mean, it doesn't have to be
I just think this is going to be a short-term committee if we move on to a data warehouse platform that you all buy into. We get into those numbers that were discussed by other PCAs and what it takes to, bring on, whatever for-profit platform they were on. I think it's going to be a different governance structure. It'll be another board. It won't be this board, that sort of thing. So I think this committee, I think the language is fine in that this committee we're still by the invoices we sent out expecting everybody to participate, and know we'll have a little bit of fallout, but I think as long as it's kind of for all 32 clinics in the direction this committee is relevant. Once we start segmenting off and having a different spending plan, I think it's going to be another governance structure.
Mm-hmm. That may not at that stage be a committee of the full board, but a committee of just those who are engaged in the effort.
Right, or there may be some continuing, depending on how the strategic plan unfolds, there may be some continuing membership-wide data strategies that would warrant the governance committee to continue with the investments and all those sort of things caught up in another governance structure.
Right.
So I think that's why, otherwise I would have said, you know what, make this a ad hoc committee, which we've had in the past, which is time limited, but I'm not clear if it's time limited until you get this process.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Craig, I like what you're saying. I agree with that. You're coming at it from a different angle, but I think to me it gets to that same question of, is this time limited by a decision or time limited by a period of learning and expectations that we have, or is there a reason to limit it by time based upon some decision that we might look at in the future? And I don't want to, I think you guys have done a great job of kind of managing that, and it makes sense to engage as many of us as you possibly can on a as long as you can. and you know, the more the merrier is my belief. So I'm trying to strike that balance where I know there are concerns, and I don't necessarily want it to go on and on and on. If in fact we've done all of the preliminary work we can do, how do we go about making a strategic decision at that point in time? And can we say after so many months, or after, you know, we've developed so many pieces, or is that really too specific? And maybe it is at this point to really get into that level of detail.
Yeah, I think it's hard to anticipate it, and in my view, this is kind of what I saw a consultant helping us to wrestle with, is what would that decision-making process and you know, the who and the how do we reach decisions like that. A consultant would help us to determine. So now I'm thinking about whether we can just have both the charter and the bylaws reflect, you know, what we started with, which is, again, this committee we're reporting to and making recommendations to the board of directors around the data strategic plan. And then I don't know if we would need to say something or if we would come back and adjust later if, you know, to the degree that if and when we're sort of exploring substantial investments or relationships with vendors or partners, that, you know, there may be a separate or defined, you know, separate defined decision-making process in that occasion, you know, in that circumstance.
This is William. I'm not sure I would go, I guess my recommendation would be not that we try and identify like a trigger point or something that we're going to do, but I'm trying to respond to the idea that we discussed this for a long time in order to get to the strategic plan and you know, the data warehouse strategic plan. And so there was a question, I think, that was coming up about, we talk about this every meeting, we talk some more, and is there a way for us to lay out what the criteria are rather than trying to get to a specific decision, or is it okay to leave it open-ended and talk? I'm okay with either way. My preference would be to be able to say, here's the mileposts along the way that we're going to, because I think it helps people to then say, oh, we passed that milepost, oh, we've done this, oh, we're ready to do something else. That it's less about the specifics and more about the what are the steps we're taking to get to some final decision. That's where I was thinking maybe an approach might be helpful.
Yeah, I agree completely. And so what I'm trying to just figure out, and I feel like I'm hearing that need not be reflected, maybe that's reflected in our goals, in what, maybe we reflect that down here in terms of our short-term goals to kind of identify that decision-making process. It sort of is referenced in item number 6 down here, but that we need not reflect it in this summary or in the bylaws to begin with. And I think if we do get to a place, as Craig suggests, that that once we've made a decision to, you know, that sort of requires commitments of in and out or substantial investment, that we may be talking about a different structure related to that. We can kind of cross that bridge when we come to it. Does that seem to make sense to folks?
Well, the one additional thing I guess Laura, I was wondering about in listening to the dialogue, I guess I should ask the question first. The dialogue is trying to focus on whether this is a time delimited committee or not. Is that what I understand from the dialogue?
Yeah, I think that's part of it. Certainly, I'm hearing, is there a time limit on our strategy to engage with a data warehouse vendor? I think, Craig offered one sort of point that the overall data strategic plan and sort of the strategy for OPCA around data need not be time limited, but I think William is asking about how we might kind of put some parameters and time limits around our work to solidify the data warehouse vendor relationship, I guess, if I'm hearing him correctly.
Well, and let me maybe speak to that a bit, because I think as I'm hearing particularly the non-OCHN health centers talk, I'm hearing that before they would necessarily consider OCHN and Accuray or going down that path, they want to know that there are other options or other ways of doing this as a collective body that would make some sense. And then I'm hearing the OCHN members speak to the fact that we should give Accuray a chance and give OCHN a chance and see if in fact we can, it's a tool that's usable and that we can make some, work with the state or what have you. I mean, I'm interpreting this my way, but so I'm thinking those are two things that we can know in some period of time, and we ought to identify what those time periods are and what the decision criteria about those are, so that what we can do is when we get there, we can say, yes, in fact, OCHN Accuray is doing what we asked them to do. They're making great headway. We have a great relationship with the state, whatever it would be, or they're not, and we found two other vendors that make good sense, and we would really like to identify whether or not that's something we would want to do. I don't know that either one of those has to be a final answer, but I think it could satisfy the fact that there are differing perspectives and needs, and it's a way for us to bring consensus to the decision about, I want to give, whether I like OCHN or whether I think they do a good job, that's the decision we made, and so I want to give them a fair shot. But at the same time, I think there are others who are saying, if I'm going to invest in OCHN interfaces or develop that, I want to make sure it's a tool that makes sense or that there are better tools out there. That's all I'm getting at, is I think we can kind of reduce it to a couple of thought processes that would allow people to feel comfortable that if a decision's being made, that it's being made with really good information.
Yeah, and I think this is Blaine. So what I was trying to kind of add to William, what you're mentioning is also not only the choice of the vendor, but how does the data that we're trying to house in the data warehouse, and what we're trying to get out of it, inform the vendor choice, and even beyond the vendor choice, I guess is what I'm thinking. And that goes back to getting good input from the governance structure that we create to make sure that not only is the vendor choice happening but at the same time we're using input from the senior leadership of the FQHCs in the state of Oregon of what are we wanting out of that, and helping that inform the vendor selection process.
Okay. Erin, do you have anything to add?
Yeah. Oh, I was just going to say this isn't really super specific, but I guess that's where I appreciate just the terminology or how we were talking about the evolutionary process, because, it's just that, what, needs will change and approach will change, and that if that's part of the, the duty of this committee is to be prepared and responsive to those changes. or, you know, just the two
Yeah.
evolving needs.
Okay, good. All right, so going to try to move us forward. So I think I'm here. I think I heard some clarity around overseeing the strategy and evolution of our strategic plan in terms of the language in the top paragraph. I'm going to come back to this description of the composition of the committee, because I do want to check in on that. We started that conversation last time. I think what I'm hearing from William, and mostly confirmed by Blaine. William, so I'm not sure if I heard you say in your question about the time frame to make a decision, I don't know if you're suggesting we should land on that today, or if you're saying we should state clearly that one of our goals is to outline the timeline for reaching a decision about that vendor relationship, and outlining the process for choosing or retaining a vendor for our data warehouse relationship. And so I would suggest that we and then concurrently the accountability plan, which I think is already reflected in those short-term goals. So I think we ought to just articulate both the decision-making process and time frame is sort of a first-order priority for the committee and under the guidance of a consultant. Does that seem to get to your points, William, or were you thinking we should agree today that we're going to commit to a year for that process or something like that?
No, I think the idea of it, I think, really responds to some of the needs of individuals who are saying, hey, I'm glad to contribute if we're considering. And so I'm just thinking of emails that I've read and the dialogue that's occurred. And I would like to, maintain that as an open, genuine process. But at some point in time, that will change. And so I just think we need to reference it. I don't think we need to get into any specifics.
Got it. Okay. Does it seem appropriate for it to be among our goals and something framed as kind of a high priority to begin defining that?
Yeah, I think it does. And I think that also answers one of my questions about how does the Data Warehouse Governance Committee interact with, so the board's one thing, but with the membership in terms of, these kind of decisions. I think it would be good to have feedback from people some way, email or what have you, that says, here's what we're thinking of. And I think you probably got that built in some, but that ongoing dialogue to me seems like it would be really important as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. All right. So
Laura, I had one other thought on the time. Sorry, just to, I know you're trying to move us along. I appreciate that. Is talking about the time. It appears to me, in my mind, if I'm not mistaken, we've approved kind of some funding in the 2018 budget, or if I'm remembering correctly, for 12 months or something like that. And so the governance structure doesn't necessarily end with that funding, and there's probably going to need to be a re-review / reauthorization of that to continue. And that, I guess I would leave that as a question. Am I correct in thinking that?
I agree with you, Blaine. I think that that's likely, and I think there are so many questions because of the nature of that decision, or sort of the evolution of a vendor relationship, that I think raises questions about what that might look like. That I'm not prepared to say a clear yes or no. I mean, an example might be if you all were to make a decision to move in a direction with a different vendor that was not subsidized by the HCCN grant, and so we had to build something of a financing model in the opt-in, opt-out process. Presumably that might include support for the kind of infrastructure you want to build around the data warehouse. You know what I mean? So would it necessarily be reauthorized at OPCA? Possibly. Would some of it? Possibly. Assuming there's an ongoing role for sort of the strategic engagement for all of OPCA. But I think there's just so many unknowns about what that looks like a year from now that I hesitate to say what it would be.
So I guess I'm wondering, when I'm looking at the dialogue we have here in front of us that you've got on the screen, and it speaks to governance, but I'm feeling like we're putting the strategies and goals into the governance. I mean, I'm wondering if those kind of need to be separated out, and that's why I was asking about the time frame, in my opinion, which is I think that data governance in some fashion may actually make sense, at least from my perspective. I thought it would, to continue, regardless of the work underlying for the vendor selection and the funding of that there may, and maybe I misunderstood or didn't even think about it along with the larger group about whether this structure, it goes back to what Craig had mentioned, is this really a longer-term ongoing committee that we're creating, or are we only creating just work for the time delineated funding / work that we have in front of us?
Mm-hmm.
This is Erin. That's where I'm at also, and then I'm getting a little sort of cloudy around the actual mission or what I thought I was signing up for when I think governance. But I totally get we've got to get our short-term goals accomplished to even move to the next level. But now I'm just getting a little, like, have lots of gray areas around our actual mission in terms of being a committee.
Yeah, I agree. I'm confused too. I think my gut would tell me I see an ongoing role for this committee to guide OPCA's data strategy into the future, period. What's challenging is that if in meeting that strategic vision, we decide that we need to shift course with respect to a vendor relationship, and if that comes with sort of significant resources needed and contributed, how that complicates sort of participation and how we oversee that vendor aspect of the relationship, I think, is the piece that I don't have any clarity around. So, and how it would interface with an ongoing strategic guiding role of this committee, I guess I agree. I don't have I think it's cloudy. I don't have a clear answer, and I do think that that's kind of the work that we have in front of us, is to better define that. And so I feel a lot more comfortable sort of outlining the short-term goals in terms of getting to, sort of standing up the committee and getting to a decision point around that vendor specifically, but then how that relates to this committee moving forward, I think, is challenging because of the potential for that opt-in, opt-out process. So, you have any wisdom, Craig, to share on this? We're overthinking it.
Yeah, just
focus on the short.
Forward, we'll figure stuff out as we go forward, and it may mean that we got to change committee participation. The short term, I think everybody's bought into. The longer term may or may not need to be a committee anymore, depending on what and if a different structure is is needed. I would just kind of think of it from the short term and know that we're going to have to go back and revisit it. Because all we're trying to do is approve. We're not going to put goals and everything in front of the bylaws committee, right? That's just our,
Correct.
you know, so that's, we're just framing our short-term work knowing that the future's uncertain. And we can take a look at how that shapes up to see if this committee wants to recommend back to the board what the ongoing purpose is.
Are folks comfortable with that?
Yeah, for sure.
All right. So what I'm hearing is I'm going to switch some of that initial language. I'm going to make the committee goals a little bit more specific with respect to sort of defining that decision-making process related to a vendor in the short term. I'm not sure if there's anything else that there is some language around it, but I'll just be a little bit more explicit about it. Any other sort of thoughts around those short-term goals? And then it's my suggestion I'm just, for now, going to take out longer-term goals referenced here for now. The ones that you do see, I think, are some of those that were referenced in our data strategic plan. So we could either leave them sort of drafty, or we could take them out if we're not prepared to kind of commit to that. I heard William speak to, I think, a little bit more concretely that item number 7 under the short-term goals, define an engagement process with other Oregon health centers. That to me kind of relates to your point about getting feedback from the rest of the membership and sort of opening and maintaining strong communication with them. I'll also say some feedback from Diane, who couldn't be on today when she looked at this in advance. She asked a question about item number 6, and, you know, I was attempting to outline our decision-making until we get to this deeper, you know, defining more deeply our decision-making process, that it would be, I heard Vanetta recommend consensus, reverting to majority rule if needed, and she asked about whether we should include proxies for a vote for that majority conversation. I don't know how folks feel about that.
This is William. I guess maybe the way for me to answer that is, there a standard structure for committees of the board and how they operate, selection of chairs that are appointed? Are there decisions that require certain, you know, activities? Is it I just don't know what the normal process would be, and is there a reason we wouldn't be using that as a kind of a starting place?
I think, William, the answer is no, and that's why we're not using that as a starting place. I do think in most cases, and when we looked at this, and we'll turn momentarily to the bylaws, you know, we're recommending that the chair of this group be an OPCA board member, and we feel like that should be consistent, but not many of them really speak to like a decision-making process or even a voting process, because ultimately the board is really, with all those committees, the board is really a decision-making, is the decision-making authority relative to these committees, and the committees are making recommendations to the board. So they don't say anything about that.
I guess I would just, my preference would be that we find some formal way to make recommendations to both the board and the membership, so that I think consensus is good, and I think you know, reverting to a majority rule as a secondary is important, but I think some of these decisions, it would be really helpful to have on the record, here's a recommendation from the Data Warehouse Committee, in my opinion.
I agree. Okay. Do folks feel strongly about a proxy, or including the ability for this committee to vote by proxy? I'm hearing no strong opinion. Okay.
Is the definition of proxy someone in my place?
Yes.
So if I had a staff person who I could put on the call, is that what I'm hearing?
Yes. I think that was the question or suggestion. And again, this is not defining our long-term decision-making processes. This is how we agree to interact until we further define that with a consultant.
I guess to me, voting by proxy opens up the opportunity of bringing in input that wasn't there the whole time.
Mm-hmm.
I think you need consistency in that. You know, if the point is somebody can't make a meeting and they have a vote that they want to put forward, then we figure out some way to do that by email.
Okay.
But if you put somebody else in on the discussion, it could just roll us back a few meetings and have to re-describe how we got to where we are.
Yeah, I agree, Craig. That's exactly what I would support as well.
Okay.
Agreed.
So not by proxy, but that voting by email or what have you, that we.
I mean, what that limits
that,
is if we have discussion that could sway their vote,
mm-hmm.
you know, but if that's what the issue is, if I can't make a meeting just because I, you know, then give them some way to weigh in.
I think we can just generally commit to that. If we have an important decision point and we don't have adequate representation, that we find an alternative way to reach that vote and make sure people understand and engage in what that conversation is. Okay. I am going to move off of this charter. I think we've got we've walked through a fair amount of it. And let's turn quickly to the bylaws, which I think will be quick based on this conversation. So I think I'm going to change most, if you could go down to the bottom, Krista, the red is, or the purple, it's purple on your version, is what I'm suggesting adding. I will adjust this language to reflect the changes we just discussed around the committee purpose. And then the other kind of big piece of this that we didn't get to and that I'll make consistent between the two documents is sort of defining what's a representative group of health centers. Here, the committee will consist of at least 5 health center or OPCA board members. And I was trying to reflect, because OCHIN is a board member, but we had the conversation that we did not want them technically on the committee, except by invitation. We want them participating, obviously, frequently. I'm not sure how to reflect excluding the data warehouse vendor. Maybe we just say that this is intended to be CHC members. And then I outlined what I thought I heard last time, that we wanted a reflective sample of large versus small clinics, executive leadership versus technical staff, OCHIN, non-OCHIN, urban, rural, public, nonprofit. And so what, if anything, am I missing there, and how do you suggest we reflect the sort of vendor relationship? Let's start with any omissions to that list of clinic characteristics.
Is there, Ms. William, is there any need to identify, I guess executive technical gets there, so it's at least 5 CHC representatives, including OPCA board members, would kind of capture that without having to say exclusive of the data warehouse vendor. So it would be CHC representatives and or OPCA board members as the limiting factor. Might be cleaner.
Okay.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Good. Okay. And as I said, this is where currently, and this is, I think, in alignment with the way the policy committee is written, is that this committee would, in that third line, make recommendations to the OPCA board regarding sort of data strategic priorities. So as we discussed, that's, I think we suggest that that's how it reads for now, and if we end up with, you know, as Craig, I don't think he's suggesting, but as Craig noted, you know, that we could have a different relationship if things change substantially, then this would change at that time.
Yeah, I'm good with that.
Okay.
Yeah,
All right.
that works for me. Laura, one question. I mean, this doesn't preclude doing what we've done in the past, which is if there was something, maybe it was the peer network of the executive directors who got together because it was a CHC directly related activity. It doesn't preclude us from doing that, but any recommendations need to go through the OPCA board in order to, you know, become approved, if you will. So I think this makes sense. Yeah.
Okay. Sounds good. All righty. So let's turn from that stuff and let's take a look specifically at our current membership. And I think we sort of naturally ended up with a pretty representative group of you know, to follow those criteria. And I think I didn't specifically look at the public. I should have. We have one public. I don't know that we.
Actually, two. We just do it.
Yeah, if you do. So as I look at this, I'll just suggest I think we could use one more non-OCHN small rural leadership position would be my recommendation, but take a moment to look through that and then let me know what you think, and if you have even you know, specific people that you'd like to recommend to participate.
I can't think of any right off the top of my head, but if there's anybody in the APM, among the APM clinics that would be non-OCHN that would fit.
Mm-hmm. Northwest Human Services is, although I don't know that I would consider them rural. So Tim Hines, you know, the folks from Valley Family are coming on that I think could fit a lot of those criteria. The one thing I'll say that I'm a tad concerned about is, as is Lane County, who's I don't think we'd consider small, but meet some of those other criteria. And my only concern is really their bandwidth during this year that they're coming on to APCM because it's time consuming, our onboarding process. But Tim did come to mind. I also thought about Rich Booth at Siskiyou. And or who's the other? Casey maybe, but I think I understand he's talking to Ocean.
Oh.
I mean, Central City does a really good job of fulfilling
I agree.
whatever.
That perspective. I think I'm considering from the standpoint, here's my thinking about sort of the two pieces. There's both the non-OCHIN, and then I think there's also this perspective of, I think a decent handful of our clinics who are small and rural areas that have a hard time with capacity issues around IT, attracting human resources to support their work, and then just from the standpoint of being small and not as well resourced maybe. I think that's kind of the perspective that I feel like would be helpful to add because, you know, you can also articulate obviously Yakima representing rural and non-OCHIN a little bit, but certainly not under-resourced.
Maybe Columbia River.
Columbia River. Okay, why don't I just add sort of a thought for that, and you guys can think and or I might make a recommendation and see if folks are agreeable.
Oh, that works for me. I wonder about, and I know, so Erin, you kind of fit this, so I'm just asking more generally, is there a place for a clinical representative, a clinician, and I'm, you know, maybe you fit that, Erin, so that's why I'm asking it generally, or does, you know, who else fits within that category? I wonder if that would be a helpful representation.
I like that thinking. I can definitely hear our clinical, more like QI leadership, you know, adding thoughts and perspective here.
Okay, why don't I
know we probably, we probably all know that we have a hard time getting people out of, if they are doing clinical work, you know, time and these sorts of things, but I like the thinking.
All right, let me take a run at that, a non-OCHIN rural clinical kind of representative, see if we can find someone to fill that.
Great. I have to go change phones. I'll be back.
Okay. Thanks, Erin. Okay, so then you'll notice that on this same framework, we have a completely blank work group for the folks involved in that we might suggest represent us to the OCHIN OPCA data work group, which this would be that subset that would feed into the CORC process. And I'm not going to seek specific recommendations today, but I just wanted to get you folks thinking about it. And I don't think that committee needs to be large, but I'd like at least one person from this committee that sort of, for continuity purposes, participates in that committee. And then I think if there are others, and I do envision that other group to be more technical in nature, and so that's probably not among the EDs of this group, but people who are either IT or QI kind of folks. So I just wanted to get you thinking about that in the next month or so. I think we would want to start populating that work group and aim for sometime in March to kind of pull that together. And if you do have facts, I'm happy to take them now.
Hey, Laura, this is William. I have a question that feeds into that. So recently, Abby invited me to participate in the CEO steering committee for EPIC. And so I said, sure. And I think they meet 4 times a year, and it's a couple of years of providing CEO feedback, I guess. And so, so I first of all wanted you all to be aware of that. I don't know what it means, if anything, but certainly being aware of it. But in talking about this data work group, my question is, who else is engaged with OCHIN in a way that would allow us to kind of engage in multiple dialogues around different levels within OCHIN that might be helpful for us as a data work group or OPCA in general to either be aware of or to use as appropriate to inform the process?
That's a great question, and I don't have a comprehensive answer for that, but maybe I can look that up, and especially as we think about this, think about kind of spreading out that engagement. And I don't know if your point is only in terms of keeping that in mind as we name people to this additional group, or I think also how can we continue to draw from the understanding and knowledge of folks who do populate those other sort of interactions with OCHIN to continue to inform our work. Is that kind of where you were headed?
Yeah, it was, and I think, you know, there are conflicts that abound everywhere, right? And so I think transparency is really important in these processes.
Okay. Great. Therese let me know, I think, that Jeremy's joined us. Is that correct, Jeremy? Or maybe you're muted.
He's gone.
Oh, maybe not. Okay.
Yeah.
Aaron jumped off and I think back on now, so. Okay. So I'll get something back out regarding that work group with a reminder to be thinking about those folks, and I'll see if I can ping the folks at OCHIN to get a clearer idea of who else is engaged in their work groups of different types. Okay, I'm again getting back to mindful of time, and I promised you that I would not use your full 2 hours, so I'm going to make a recommendation that I'm going to not go into detail around the consultant's scope of work, but ask for your input offline. And I'll just say this, I think I would like to restructure and make sure that I think this is already the case, but I'm going to add in bold or kind of imply that the scope of work is prioritized with respect to establishing the governance structure and a long-term decision-making process, as well as the performance framework and accountability plan for OCHIN and Accuray, that those are the 2 sort of primary issues for scope of work. And if you guys feel like there are other things that should be high on the list, that would be great to know. I'm also curious to know if you have additional thoughts about consulting resources. So we don't have this, I don't think we need to pull this up, but I'll just list 3 of the folks that I had anticipated sending an RFP to is Gretchen Morley, who's an independent consultant we're doing some work with in around the APCM data group. She's very smart, technical, and I think could be really helpful on that end. I included Diana Bianco, who I think probably less technical, but really good on kind of the governance questions that we're talking about. You folks are familiar from our strategic planning process with Diana. And then there's also the Cedar Bridge Group, which Carol Robinson heads up, and there are a number of consultants who work underneath that group, and they very specifically do IT data consulting. So I thought they would be, and those are all local folks, and I know, you know, Roger also, obviously, I think we felt really good about the work that he did for us. I think with respect to these governance issues and, you know, we were thinking it would be helpful to have someone more locally based, but if you guys have thoughts about engaging Roger or other recommendations, I'm happy to hear them. Any ideas, or do you want to get back to me?
Just, I can send you more, but are you guys familiar with Health Management Associates? The only reason I am is because a couple of physicians, one who is here as a locums at Richmond sometime, does some different technical kind of like TA and consulting, but they have like many different, like, you know, there's like a whole bunch of health IT stuff they do and a whole load of other things, but I could just
Send that my
if
way.
we needed more people on the list, yeah.
Okay.
Great.
All right, anyone else? Oh,
Are
go
they
ahead.
out of Portland?
We
I know
have
they have
people
an
in Portland, but they are more east and Midwest.
Okay, the person you're referring to, though, is that person out of the Portland office?
Yeah. In fact, so the physician is Janine Smith.
Oh, okay, yeah.
We love
Yeah.
And she's
yeah,
worked with
I
a
think,
ton of people in the area.
yeah. Okay, thanks, Erin. That'd be helpful. If others have ideas, please forward them my way, and I will, as part of the follow-up to today, I'll ask you to respond more concretely to that scope of work and get me any ideas or edits that you want to see there. Okay.
Hey, Laura.
Yeah.
Just one quick one. So on a statement of work or you know, an expected deliverable, one of the questions that keeps coming back up for me time and again is affordability. And what we want versus what we can afford might be two completely different things. And so I'm wondering how much of this exercise would be in informing the process, informing us health centers about the potential cost of different options, and not as a way of scaring people off, but as a way of really kind of testing the waters to see, hey, this might be this level of investment in order to accomplish these kind of activities. I don't know if that's vendor related or if it's, you know, just based on experience elsewhere or gathering and aggregating different processes that other PCAs went through. I'm not sure how to get there, but it seems to me that if we're asking the question of whether we should choose another option than OCHIN, and we know that the cost is going to be X, triple X, you know, quadruple X more, then we have to ask ourselves, do we even want to go through the exercise if in fact we don't have a large enough group to really move that process forward? And I'm not trying to you know, telegraph that solution on the front end, but I do think sometimes we get caught up in all the things we want, and I would love for us to make sure we're talking about what something like this costs in order for us to implement and maintain over time.
That's good, and how the cost varies by denominator. So, I know the cost is dependent on, how big the organization is and how many, whatever their kind of visit or model of payment is. But that would help too, because if we have a certain number that are in OCHIN that choose to stay in OCHIN, then whoever's not going to go through OCHIN to this new model, what does that do to the cost? So.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so I think that I thought you were speaking to the cost of our consultant at first, William. But I think fair point. And so while so I don't know if it's part of the decision-making process or something yet separate, kind of a robust tool to evaluate the cost of different options would be helpful to include. Okay. Krista, I'm going to turn it over to you to start. So as I noted, we do want one of the first items of this consultant to be to help us flesh out further a performance framework and accountability plan for Accuray. But Krista's going to help us kind of start that conversation so that we're not working from a blank sheet when we get someone on to help us with this.
Yeah, definitely. So sorry about that. So we somehow got on mute. Yeah, thank you, Laura. So I put together just a couple slides, and I'm going to go through the first three just because I know Erin's new to this group, and just go through really quickly, like what what we hope to discuss in the next couple minutes. So as you guys know, as part of this group, one of the deliverables is to kind of find a way to really identify, like, when working with OCHIN or really any other vendor, if it comes to that down the line, how do we know that they're meeting the needs of the broader network and that they're producing a data warehouse that the group wants to, that feels is robust and of high quality. So in conversations with Roger, when we were talking about, how to track that work, the idea of a performance tracker, which was originally called accountability plan, but we're straying away from that because of, APCM. We don't need accountability plans, essentially. But the idea of, like, tracking the progress of the vendor in regards to meeting certain requests. So this is really specifically about how do we track with OCHIN, who's our first vendor for Accuray, that they're meeting the requests of this particular group. So that's where the idea came in conversation around creating a performance tracker. This is just an example of what that might look like. This is from OCHIN, I believe. Just a general idea. It's pretty simple. And then along with that, to come up with also just some general, like, milestones and other, like, higher level ways we'll know that OCHIN is working on the different pieces that this group identifies as a top priority. So looking at user feedback, tickets backlog, and a variety of other different metrics that we would track over time. So, just in general, high level, though, this is really about, where do we start? We thought we would kind of start the conversation, though, about, really, like, when it comes to OCHIN and Accuray, scoping that out, or having a little bit of a conversation, at least at this time, of, when creating the performance tracker, what are the key items that should be listed on that at this time? What items does this group want OCHIN to prioritize when building out Accuray? What items will help us determine the success of Accuray as a data warehouse? Thinking about that plotting it via timeline, getting feedback from OCHN about what's reasonable, what can be completed by when, but really kind of essentially building out a plan for what we want to see happen specifically with the Curie within, you know, a time determined by this group. So does that sound, are we all on the same page? Sound good, clear? Okay. So in regards to a couple buckets of work, you know, some of the things that we've heard from you guys on the phone and in terms of membership, you know, there's been some feedback around questions around reports, wanting UDS data and a variety of different things. There's 9 health centers participating in the HCCN grant that will have their data ingested into a Curie. You know, questions around, do we want to see social determinants of health data in a Curie? You know, and a variety of different ideas. So I guess my question for this group, this is really just meant to be as a brainstorm. So if we were to, well, we want to like identify what to have on the performance tracker and what to prioritize and say to OCHN, like these are the things that we want to be seen as being built out in the next 3 to 6 months or whatever timeline. Like, what would you guys list as those high priority items in regards to Curie?
I don't think I have the brain for 10 minutes. And I'm also not sure that I was thinking that like things on the list are what I was thinking would be part of a performance tracker. Like these all look like good things. We must have them. But in terms of like, are they doing what they say they're going to do by when?
Correct.
That's as far as my brain goes in this moment. And I'm going to have to, because I'm already thinking of my next call. Sorry.
This is Gil, and sorry I joined really late, got kind of wires crossed on this in another meeting. But these all look like good items to have in the development for, you know, what do we want this thing to do for us. I think this starts to get at that because ultimately, you know, having a tool that helps us with our APCM accountability plan, which a lot of these things speak to that would really be helpful. And then to start even at a small level of ingesting the total cost of care data that is for which it's available. And I think that gets to it. So if we were to give OCHN, you know, these are the kinds of things we're looking for, go out and develop them, you know, and then we can sort of track how they're doing along those lines and you know, what kinds of format they can give it to us in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would see it kind of being, there's essentially 2 pieces. There's one kind of a timeline, you know, of how we hope to see a Curie develop within the next year, whatever we define as a group, and specific deliverables. So what you're alluding to, Gil, like start the process of total cost of care data, you know, having all the UDS reports built and having them be accurate and, you know, tested. And then there's this other piece, which is kind of alluding to like what Erin was talking about, where it's like, you know, responsiveness and, you know, really kind of like one's a project oriented in terms of the build out of a Curie and what we all think of the network should be in there and having some say in that and fleshing that out. And then there's the other part of like JIRA tickets being responded to and kind of the technical piece. So.
Yeah, and
this William.
Go ahead.
I was just going to ask if we've asked Ochin how we should hold them accountable. They do a lot of this work around their own performance and you know, trying to deliver under a service level agreement to different people. So I wonder if their input into something like this might be helpful as to at least informing our decision. I certainly don't want them telling us what to measure, but I do think they have systems that they measure these things already, and we can trust that they have integrity in their process. So why wouldn't we, you know, add that to the list, not necessarily replace?
My guess is they would fall more to that JIRA tracker or those sort of things, which is that, and I would guess this committee would want to focus a lot more on the outcomes. Like, do you have a report by a certain amount of time, and does it work? So they may be able to weigh in on that, but my guess is from looking at their look at how they're doing, it's more based on those technical things. And they could meet all those technical things and miss the boat on the outcomes.
Right.
This group will want to focus on the outcomes.
Yeah, I think both are really critical, and my impression is that those technical things that started out under the last slide that Krista showed, this one, are some of their suggestions, I think, in terms of things we can use. And I agree with sort of two things. We could look exclusively at those outcomes related to generating, you know, UDS and or APCM reports and what have you, and they could check the boxes on those things, and the accuracy of them might not be you know, where we need it to be, and the sort of the use rates might not be what we need it to be. And similarly, some of these metrics around really sort of the technical details you could be missing before us. So I think it's important to pair them both, and I guess we're just sort of asking, is there anything kind of missing? And I think we want to give, and I agree totally that we want Ochin's input and perspective on how they would track some of these performance milestones, and then, but then I've also heard sort of some challenges, for example, with the JIRA process, and that's just sort of inherently a challenging way to have priorities addressed, and I don't, you know, so I'm wondering if there's something better than that to look at kind of problem resolution, and I'm just throwing it out there. I don't know the answer.
Yeah, and I also wonder, like, how in the weeds this will get to, because you know, Ochin has these systems for all of its network. So even just outside of like this specific group, and then also outside of Oregon, when it comes to like JIRAs and submitting, like, you know, how will they differentiate feedback from this group between, I don't know. It's just a complicated system, but either way, I think, you know, to me, you know, what this group, a lot of the power that this group holds is, you know, what do we want a Curay to look like in regards to making it a product that Oregon clinics are really satisfied with. And it seems like maybe one of the first steps is to start really high level to some extent, some of the things that we have listed on here, and then also we've requested from Ochin kind of their Curay roadmap, which talks a little bit about, you know, what are their plans for building out a Curay, and when do they plan to have some of these deliverables done, such as like the UDS data, for example. You know, so kind of having an idea about like what's being planned. Is there anything that they're not doing that they should be, that we'd like to request of them? And then maybe that's where, after the high level, we can talk about, you know, the accuracy of the reports and those kind of things. And to me, that might fall to the OPCA Ochin technical work group, where they start to watch it, or look at a report and say like, well, this seems kind of fishy, or, you know, something along those lines, kind of the technical work group, while this one really sets the vision for the product.
Yeah.
It's kind of what I'm thinking, and I'm curious, you know, with the governance committee, if you think that that's kind of the right role, is not only first establishing the performance tracker and how we'll know whether or not this is a success, but two, what are the priority items we want to see with the Cure?
You know, I think that fits for me. I was thinking along the lines of, and maybe we don't want to do this with Ochin, but we may want to do it ourselves, is what should they expect from us in order to be successful? What kind of prioritization or what type of dialogue or what type of expectations, and how do we communicate those to them? Because we're going to have to come to our own agreement before we communicate that in order to be successful. So maybe there's something in there around our own performance as a network or as the data work group might be helpful as well.
Mm-hmm. A great point.
You know, the other thought that I have is, you know, part of Ochin's success in building out what we want this to be is going to be dependent upon how available the data is going to be to ingest, you know, whether we're talking about state, you know, from statewide data or from all payer, all claims, or from individual CCOs, you know, so we sort of need to keep that into consideration, you know, with judging the performance, because, you know, it may be that they're hampered in how well they can deliver to us what we need by outside forces.
Correct.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Any other thoughts?
I need to jump off, but good stuff.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Erin.
Great. See ya.
I almost wonder if one thing we should do is look at the roadmap that Ochin has, which says, you know, here's what we plan to do with the Cure in the next year or whatever. Take a look at that and say what's missing, and have this group weigh in on that as a potential process.
Mm-hmm.
What do you guys think about that idea?
That sounds good to me.
Okay.
Okay, yeah, I think that'd be good. And I'm also, you know, noting that Erin was spent at the end of the call and that we didn't have other technical folks on. So I think a combination of this group, and then if we need more kind of technical feedback to say, articulate what the target is for, you know, report, as an example, report validity, that we tap other people if need be to kind of find out what the expectations are around there.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. Well, I can hear from everyone that we're at the end of our time. But thank you. I think we really dug through a lot of challenging questions at the outset around that charter and the relationship of this committee to the board and things of that nature. So I'll be revising those documents and getting this back out. Between now and our next meeting, as I said, I really would like some concrete feedback offline on that consultant scope of work, any other recommendations you may have, and I'd like to actually be able to start moving that forward between now and our next meeting. You'll also see the updates to these documents we talked about today. So any other questions or thoughts, things to prioritize for our next meeting before we call it a day? Okay, thanks again, guys.
Thank you.
Talk to you next.